John 8:7. Cum autem perseverarant interrogantes eum, erexit se et dixit eis, qui sine peccatos vestrum primus in illam lapidem mittat. But when they continued to ask him questions, he straightened himself up and he said to them, "He among you who is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." As Jesus' conversation with those accusing a woman caught in adultery continues here, we get another pretty dramatic speech from Jesus, which we'll designate with some punctuation like this. And we're never told, interestingly, in explanation of the previous verse, what it was that he was writing on the ground. Commentators differ in their solutions to this mystery, and I will let you look that up for yourselves, since we're just going to concern ourselves with the Latin here. But this is a very interesting episode, and it provides some intellectual stimulation for us as well as we think through the Latin grammar. So first of all, we need to recognize that we have a cum circumstantial clause here that's going to cause an occurrence of the subjunctive. And here, just like we saw at one point in the previous verse, we're going to have an imperfect subjunctive, which again, in terms of the morphology, looks like, this is an easy way to remember it, the present infinitive plus personal endings. That's an easy way to recognize the imperfect subjunctive. Here from the verb persevero, to continue or persist in doing something. So what we have is, but when they were continuing, and in English we would say to ask questions of him, to ask him questions. We would use an infinitive, but in Latin instead you can use a participle. Now there's actually a few different ways that this could happen in Latin. A participle being used this way is a little bit unusual, or so it seems to me anyway, based on my experience with this verb, persevero. More often you see persevero with actually also an infinitive in Latin. So we might have interrogare, and that would be perfectly acceptable and correct. They continued to ask questions of him, to insist on answers from him, something like that. We could also even use in interrogando, but here instead we've got interrogantes, and it makes perfect sense as it is. It just seems a little bit unusual to me. Probably this is just a late antique Latin thing, or perhaps I've seen it more often in classical Latin, but I'm forgetting that I have seen it. But it strikes me now as a little bit worthy of comment, again, especially if most of your learning has been with classical Latin. So in the condition in which they are all continuing to ask him these questions, what does he do? Erexit se, he straightens himself up, he lifts himself up, because he had been inclinans se deorsum in the previous verse, right? He had been bending himself downward towards the ground. So erexit means he lifts himself, straightens up, we would say in English. And he said to them, in the dative plural, as we've seen so often. Now, there's a lot of interesting things going on here. He of you all, and this is the genitive form of the plural, second person plural, personal pronoun that you use when you want a genitive of the whole. So when you're saying things like none of you, that's how we would say it in English. In Latin, we'd have to say something like nemo vestrum, no one of y'all, of you all. When we want to say things like that, we're going to use vestrum and not vestri, which is another genitive form that exists but is used in different circumstances, most often with objective genitives, which we won't talk about now. But vestrum is what we usually see and what we want here. So take it with qui. He who of you all is without sin, that is, he from among you who is without sin, And then we've got a jussive subjunctive. This is one of those independent subjunctive uses. Let him, I guess we don't really need the dots there. Let him throw, for mitto here. And this is an idiomatic use of this word, which can also mean send, among other things. Let him throw the stone at her, against her. Let him be the first one to do that. Let him be the first one to throw the stone against her. Now in English, in many English translations, we say, let him cast the first stone. But what we have here in Latin is primus, let him be the first person to cast a stone against her or at her.